At the twilight of empire, the red, white, and blue of France's tricolor was hauled down for the last time in Hanoi on the 9th of August, 1954, and a humid silence settled over the colonial villas along the Boulevard Carnot. In that hush, a new map was drawn, with the stroke of fountain pens in Geneva, slicing the elongated nation at the 17th parallel like a scalpel across the spine of a dragon. To the north, Ho Chi Minh's Democratic Republic moved swiftly, consolidating ministries inside the mustard-yellow palace that had once housed the French resident general. To the south, a former Mandarin named Dien Bien returned from exile in New Jersey, stepping off a silver American transport plane onto Saigon's tarmac in a crisp khaki suit and black Homburg. Washington's money followed him like a shadow. By 1955, the United States was pouring $1 million a day into a country most Americans could not find on a classroom globe. The cash built new ministries, new barracks, and a new national army whose helmets still carried the French emblem painted over hastily with the gold and red stripes of the Republic of Vietnam. Yet beneath the fresh paint, old fissures widened. Diem, a devout Catholic in a nation 80% Buddhist, filled his cabinet with fellow Catholics from the refugee north, their offices scented with incense and the faint metallic smell of typewriter ribbons. In pagodas across the Mekong Delta, monks in saffron robes whispered that the president's brother, the hawk-faced Archbishop No Din Thuk, was treating pagodas like enemy outposts. By 1958, shadowy cadres, soon labeled Viet Cong by the Saigon press, slipped across the demilitarized zone, carrying canvas sacks of Chinese-made rifles and mimeographed leaflets promising land reform. Their insurgency spread like ink in water. American advisors arrived first in twos and threes, wearing civilian clothes and carrying Smith & Wesson revolvers under loose linen jackets. By 1962, 12,000 United States Army and Air Force personnel were stationed in-country, their green uniforms standing out against the white French colonial architecture like new shoots on an old tree. Kennedy, youthful and cerebral, sent them with instructions to train and not to fight, yet the border between teaching and killing blurred in the heat. Each captured village radioed up a chain of command that ended in a mahogany-paneled room in Washington, where maps were colored red for communist control, pink for contested, white for free. The Cold War lens turned every rice paddy into a domino, every Buddhist monk into a potential agent of Moscow or Peking. Diem's response was repression. In May 1963, a 73-year-old monk named Thich Quang Duc sat lotus-style at a busy Saigon intersection, doused himself in gasoline, and struck a match. The photograph flashed across the world, and American editorial pages asked whether Washington was backing the right side. Kennedy, reading the morning briefings in the White House solarium, muttered that Diem had lost touch with reality. 3 weeks later, on the 2nd of November, 1963, Saigon radio crackled with the news that Diem and his brother had been shot in the back of an armored personnel carrier. In Dallas, 20 days after, Kennedy fell beneath a rifle's echo in Dealey Plaza, and the smoldering fuse of Vietnam passed to a Texan who had never wanted the job. Lyndon Baines Johnson, sworn in aboard Air Force One with Jacqueline Kennedy's blood still on his coat, looked at the map and saw only red ink spreading southward. The seeds of empire had been planted. Now the nightmare would begin to grow. The fuse, already smoldering, now burned with presidential urgency. In the cramped cabin of the presidential aircraft, Johnson traced the widening stain of red on the map, each mark representing villages lost to the Viet Cong, each arrow the slow advance of Ho Chi Minh's dream of reunification. By midsummer 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin shimmered under monsoon skies, deceptively calm. On the 2nd of August, the destroyer Maddox cut through gray waters, its radar pinging the unseen. 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats emerged from the mist like sharks scenting blood. The Maddox's guns spoke first, thunder rolling across the water. 2 nights later, in the darkness of the 4th of August, radar screens flickered again. This time, the attack might have been phantom, electronic ghosts dancing across screens, but the message reached Washington: hostile fire. Johnson summoned congressional leaders to the White House on the 5th. In the cabinet room, he brandished a single photograph, an alleged attack that may never have happened. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed the Senate 88-2, the House 416-0. Johnson signed it with a quiet pen stroke on the 10th of August, unleashing what he called the biggest damn mess I ever saw. Operation Rolling Thunder began on the 2nd of March 1965, 300 sorties in the first week alone. Napalm canisters tumbled like silver coffins from Bombays, jellied gasoline that clung to flesh and jungle alike. Each explosion painted the landscape in liquid fire, trees exploding into torches, villages becoming funeral pyres. The draft machine awakened with mechanical precision. On the 17th of March, the Selective Service System began calling up men born between 1944 and 1948, 18-year-olds whose lottery numbers would etch their futures in indelible ink. In April, General William Westmoreland cabled Washington. He needed 175,000 troops by year's end. Johnson approved without hesitation. America's longest war had begun in earnest. On living room television sets across America, Walter Cronkite's measured voice introduced the nightly ritual. And in Vietnam today, followed by the first body counts. 12 Americans dead, 147 Viet Cong killed. The numbers became a grim scoreboard, each evening bringing new tallies, each tally bringing fresh protests. By December, draft cards burned on college campuses like small rebellions. At the University of California, Berkeley, students surrounded the draft office, chanting, "Hell no, we won't go." The nightmare had taken root, not just in Vietnamese jungles, but in American hearts and minds. Johnson, who had inherited an empire's burden, now carried a nation's growing revulsion. The Gulf of Fire had been lit, and from its flames, no one would emerge unscathed. Jungle Inferno. The year is 1965, and the Central Highlands of Vietnam have become a living furnace. General William Westmoreland stands before a map dotted with red pins, each representing a search-and-destroy mission that will carve fresh scars across this ancient landscape. He promises the assembled reporters that there is light at the end of the tunnel, but his voice carries the hollow ring of a man who has never walked through napalm fire. The first major operation, codenamed Starlight, begins on August 18th. 3,000 Marines storm ashore near Van Tuong village, their faces grim beneath the weight of 60-pound packs. Within hours, the jungle becomes an inferno of automatic weapons fire and screaming artillery. But it is the napalm that transforms this landscape into true hell. The jelly-like substance clings to everything it touches: trees, huts, human skin. Villagers run screaming, their silhouettes etched against the orange fireballs like living shadows. Children clutch their mothers as the sticky fire consumes everything in its path. The helicopter blades thump like war drums across the highlands. Each day, more young Americans arrive to replace the fallen. Each night, the body bags stack higher at Dover Air Force Base, wrapped tight in American flags. Back home, the draft net widens to catch even those with college deferments. The first teach-in begins at the University of Michigan in March 1965. Professor Arnold Kaufman stands before 3,000 students, explaining why this war violates every principle of American democracy. The movement spreads like wildfire across campuses. At Berkeley, Mario Savio leads thousands in civil disobedience training. Young men burn their draft cards in metal trash cans, the smoke rising like incense against a darkening sky. In Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh walks the leafy grounds of the presidential palace. He is 75 years old now, his beard gone white, but his eyes still burn with revolutionary fire. When American negotiators suggest he surrender, he responds with quiet dignity. "We will fight for as long as it takes." The numbers tell a story of escalating horror. By the end of 1967, nearly 16,000 Americans lie dead. Vietnamese casualties remain uncounted, but the destroyed villages speak their own terrible mathematics. The jungle has become America's testing ground, and the test is failing. Each search-and-destroy mission creates more enemies than it eliminates. Each promise of victory rings more hollow against the backdrop of burning villages and screaming children. And still, the war grinds on, consuming everything it touches. The Inferno has only just begun to burn. The Lunar New Year of 1968 arrived not with celebration, but with the hiss of rockets cutting through the velvet darkness above Saigon. At precisely 3 minutes past 3 in the morning, on January 30th, the first wave of Viet Cong commandos scaled the outer walls of the United States Embassy on Thong Nhat Boulevard. Inside, 5 Marines fought desperately to hold the compound as bullets shattered the embassy's plate glass windows and pockmarked the marble facade. For 23 agonizing hours, the heart of American power in South Vietnam became a shooting gallery. The Tet Offensive had begun, and it was everywhere at once. Hue, Da Nang, more than 100 towns and cities simultaneously erupting in coordinated fury. This was not the scattered guerrilla war American generals had promised they were winning. The television crews were there, rolling film as Saigon streets turned into a nightmare. Cameraman Vo Hu Tu captured the moment South Vietnamese police chief Nguyen Ngoc Loan raised his pistol and executed a bound Viet Cong prisoner on a busy street. The photograph would win the Pulitzer Prize and shatter what remained of American moral authority. General William Westmoreland appeared before television cameras, insisting that the offensive was actually a victory. The enemy has exposed himself, and we are taking advantage of it. But Walter Cronkite, the most trusted voice in America, had seen enough. After touring the devastated streets of Hue, Cronkite looked directly into the camera and told 28 million Americans, "It is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy." President Lyndon Johnson watched the broadcast from the Oval Office, his face gray and drawn in the harsh television light. He turned to Press Secretary George Christian and whispered, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." 2 months later, on March 31st, Johnson appeared on national television to announce he would not seek re-election. The draft numbers surged past 300,000 that spring. In Detroit, 19-year-old David Harris stood on the federal courthouse steps and held his draft card above a burning match. As the card curled into ash, he shouted, "This war is not worth 1 American life, let alone 50,000. The mask had cracked. The confident promises of victory, the nightly body counts, the assurances that light was visible at the end of the tunnel, all lay shattered in the rubble of Hugh's ancient citadel. American boys continued dying in the elephant grass while their country tore itself apart. The Tet Offensive had failed militarily. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong suffered devastating losses. But in the living rooms of America, it succeeded beyond Ho Chi Minh's wildest dreams. The war had come home, and there would be no more business as usual. Richard Nixon took the oath of office beneath winter gray skies on January 20th, 1969. Hand raised, voice calm, promising a secret plan for peace with honor. Few listeners guessed that within a year, he would widen the war he vowed to end. The draft, once a maze of college deferments and family doctor letters, became a national lottery of pure chance on December 1st, 1969. Birth dates were pulled one by one. September 14th meant you were almost certainly going. February 29th meant you could breathe. Across campuses, the reaction was volcanic. At Columbia, students occupied buildings for 8 days, barricading doors with piled furniture and issuing manifestos from second-story windows. Police stormed in before dawn on April 30th, swinging batons, dragging protesters down stone steps streaked with blood. Nixon answered unrest with silence, then escalation. On April 30th, 1970, he told the nation on television that American troops had entered Cambodia to destroy enemy sanctuaries. The announcement detonated the campuses anew. Kent State University exploded first. By noon on May 4th, 1,000 protesters ringed the victory bell, hurling rocks at the Ohio National Guard. The guard advanced, then suddenly turned and fired. 4 students fell dead. 9 more writhed on the ground, bleeding. Jeffrey Miller cradled his camera as the bullet took him. Allison Krauss died with a peace symbol on her denim jacket. The nation gasped. The killings turned protest into mourning, then into rage. On November 15, 1969, the Moratorium March filled the mall with 500,000 quiet souls. A second march 4 months later saw police lob tear gas at marchers chanting, "Peace now." Meanwhile, Jane Fonda arrived in Hanoi in July 1972. North Vietnamese cameras filmed her touring bombed hospitals, cradling burned children. Then came the photograph. Fonda perched on an anti-aircraft gun, helmet on her head, smiling. The image reached American televisions and detonated fury. Veterans mailed her death threats. Record stores burned her exercise albums. Yet nightly, more body bags arrived at Dover Air Force Base. By 1970, American ground troops had peaked at 543,000. Nixon and Henry Kissinger spoke in whispers about Vietnamization, training South Vietnamese to fight alone. But secret bombing of Cambodia continued, hidden from Congress and public alike. The war had come home, not as victory parades, but as draft cards, tear gas, and funeral processions. America turned inward, questioning every promise its leaders made. In the jungles, the fighting ground on. But the real battle was now on streets and campuses and living rooms, where trust had died. The breaking point arrived on the last day of April 1970, when Richard Nixon stepped before the nation and announced that American troops were crossing into Cambodia. Campuses exploded overnight. At Kent State University, the National Guard opened fire on May 4th, killing 4 students and wounding 9. The photograph of a teenage girl kneeling over a fallen student ran on front pages across the world. Within 48 hours, 450 colleges shut down in the first nationwide student strike in American history. Professors walked out. High schoolers marched. Construction workers in New York, once the hard-hat heroes of patriotism, clashed with protesters in the Wall Street Canyon. Meanwhile, in the jungles of Vietnam, morale collapsed like wet sand. Fragging incidents, enlisted men tossing fragmentation grenades into officers' tents, rose from 126 in 1969 to 334 in 1971. Napalm canisters, still labeled in cheerful yellow stencil, "Made in USA," continued to tumble from phantom jets, splashing liquid fire across villages. Each drop was photographed by foreign correspondents and beamed to living rooms from Paris to Peoria. Draft evaders slipped north by the thousands. At the Peace Arch border crossing, Mounties stood aside as young Americans stepped into Canada without papers. Others chose open defiance. In Boston, a former seminary student chained himself to the filing cabinets of Draft Board 114 and read the names of the dead over a portable radio. Henry Kissinger, shuttling in secret between Washington and Paris, carried a briefcase stuffed with coded maps and half-promises. Talks began, stalled, began again, each collapse announced only by the renewed roar of engines over the Mekong. Veterans came home not to parades, but to silence. At Travis Air Force Base, returning soldiers stepped off chartered Boeings into empty hangars. Some wore their medals under civilian shirts, hiding bronze stars like guilty secrets. By Christmas 1972, Nixon decided to end the war with a thunderclap. Operation Linebacker 2 unleashed B-52 Stratofortresses in tight formations, their contrails braiding across a cold December sky. For 11 nights, Hanoi shook to the Wagnerian rhythm of 2,000-pound bombs and sirens. Kissinger cabled from Paris that the North Vietnamese had returned to the table, but the cost was a city in flames and American credibility reduced to ash. When the last aircraft turned south on December 29th, the crews saw the black scar of their own handiwork stretching for miles. Back home, the television networks carried the images without commentary, letting the silent devastation speak for itself. The breaking point had passed, but the breaking had only begun. January 27th, 1973. A gray Parisian morning leaks through the tall windows of the Hotel Majestic, gilded ballrooms shimmering under crystal chandeliers that have witnessed empires rise and fall. Henry Kissinger, round-faced and already famous for shuttle diplomacy, steps forward in a charcoal suit. Across from him, Le Duc Hioto, lean and ascetic in a dark Mao jacket, extends a hand that once carried messages down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The flashbulbs pop like distant artillery. Each man smiles, but for utterly different reasons. Kissinger believes he has secured peace with honor. Le Duc Hioto knows he has merely bought time. Within 72 hours, the last American combat boots are lifted by helicopter from a fire base near Saigon. The whine of turbines fades, replaced by an eerie quiet that feels foreign after a decade of constant engine noise. On the tarmac at Travis Air Force Base in California, the first planeload of American prisoners of war touches down on February 12th. The men emerge skeletal, blinking against the hard California sun, that seems obscene after years of jungle gloom. A few dozen civilians clap politely, but the stands are mostly empty. The country has already moved on. 2 weeks later, on March 29th, Selective Service announces that no more young men will be called. The lottery drums fall silent. The televised drawing of birth dates becomes a relic overnight. Yet in dormitories and coffee houses, no one quite believes the nightmare is over. They have learned that wars declared finished can reignite without warning. In Saigon, President Nguyen Van Thieu watches the American departure with growing dread. He knows the Paris Accords grant North Vietnamese troops the right to remain below the 17th parallel, a Trojan horse clause he never wanted. Within weeks, fresh Soviet artillery pieces roll down the Ho Chi Minh Trail under jungle canopies so thick American satellites cannot see them. Meanwhile, 5,000 miles away, the Watergate scandal metastasizes. Every evening, Americans turn from Saigon to Senate hearings, from body counts to taped transcripts. Richard Nixon, who campaigned on a secret plan to end the war, now fights for his political life as the war outlasts his presidency. By spring of 1974, the promised ceasefire has become a bitter joke. North Vietnamese regulars probe South Vietnamese defenses like a dentist testing a loose tooth. In Washington, Congress slashes military aid to Saigon, tired of throwing good money after bad. The handwriting appears not on any palace wall, but in budget ledgers no one wants to read aloud. On a humid August evening, Nixon resigns on national television. He speaks of regrets, but never once mentions the word Vietnam. The war he inherited will grind on another 16 months without him, a ghost that refuses to be exorcised. The morning of April the 30th, 1975, begins with rotor blades slapping humid air above Saigon. Embassy Marines shove shredded files into oil drums already burning low. On the roof, a Huey hovers, wheels skimming the white gravel. Below in the streets, North Vietnamese T-54 tanks grind through iron gates of Independence Palace. The war that began 20 years earlier ends in a 30-hour scramble. By nightfall, 125,000 refugees sail east across the South China Sea. Many clutch photographs already curling in salt air. Their destination is Guam, then Camp Pendleton, then Strip Mall America. Back home, veterans step off charter flights into silence. No brass bands, no confetti, only baggage handlers looking away. At the VA hospital in Phoenix, a former sergeant wakes screaming from phantom rotor sounds. Agent Orange claims its first public casualty when a pilot reveals skin lesions on Walter Cronkite. The chemical ghost drifts through hospital corridors for decades. On college quads, students who burn draft cards now study pre-law beside former grunts using GI Bill tuition. The draft becomes a cautionary tale, whispered in dorm basements. Napalm enters the language as moral in uti effet. Jane Fonda hands microphones to former prisoners of war at a Los Angeles forum. Their voices crack, describing bamboo cages. Congress slashes veterans' benefits the same week Saigon falls. The ledger of regret grows heavier. In the Mekong Delta, unexploded ordnance still glints beneath rice paddies. At the Vietnam Veterans Memorial groundbreaking in 1982, a mother traces her son's name. The war ends, but never ends. Every August, rotor echoes return to certain dreams. The jungle becomes a mirror held up to the American soul. What stared back still waits. The longest war leaves the longest shadow.